American water polo.
Hi, this is Damon Newman from American Water Polo, and we're here today with David Throop to learn some of the best practices from experienced officials in our Behind the Whistle series. How you doing, David?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got started in officiating.
I think it was a kind of a natural progression. I coached for a number of years, and while I was coaching, especially coming up through the ranks, I started it out probably a decade ago or 15 years ago as something to do in between seasons, because out here in California, we have a guys season, a girls season, club season. So it's something to kind of work on my understanding of the game and involvement with the kids. And then as I kind of took a back seat from that introduction to refereeing, to officiating, and kind of fully delved into coaching. And about 5 years ago, my family and I decided we wanted to grow, but I wanted to stay involved in the game. So I left coaching and just wanted to stay involved and see what I could do to be involved in the game in a different aspect.
Okay, cool, excellent. Now you've been working in water polo for however long, so now you don the whites.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
First couple games were a unique experience in the whites,
yeah,
that's for sure.
yeah, I'm sure. Being a former coach myself, making that jump can be challenging for sure.
Yeah.
So typically, for the younger officials out there watching this, what are some of the things you do when you arrive on deck before a game?
The very first thing I do is, I don't usually arrive in my whites. Obviously, this is a pandemic time period, but my typical process would be to arrive, kind of scan the facility, look at, what would be some trouble areas on an outdoor pool. Is it a weather or sun, a reflection issue?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of, pathway on the pool deck? If it's an indoor pool, is there a water issue of water retaining on the deck? What are some things that just immediately might affect my concentration and take away my sight from coverage areas of the pool? Looking at the general outlay, where are the shot clocks? Where's the game clock? Do we have a desk set up that's visual that I'd be able to communicate with? And the more games you do, the more experience you're going to have in understanding that every facility is going to be different. And so just getting a roadmap in your mind of where some trouble parts might happen and some things that you can try to mitigate before the games begin. Then I go get dressed and I try to introduce myself to the desk staff and each coach individually, and just say, hello, and I kind of leave it at that.
Okay. Excellent. So obviously water polo, if you're working with a partner, you might not necessarily know him or her. And we talk a lot about collaboration and officiating. What does that sound like? What's that conversation like with someone that you might not necessarily know, or even maybe somebody that you've worked with before?
Usually when it's conversation with collaboration, I usually kind of prompt it like, hey, what do you like?
Okay.
What do you, what are your areas of coverage? What are your, concepts? And I try to mold to my partner just a little bit. If it's a less experienced official, I try to give them some guidance, but in polite ways, like, hey, this is kind of what I'm looking for in the front court. This is kind of what I'm looking for in the back court. And if it's someone I've never worked with before, it's more of a feel out process, a dialogue, prior to the game. What can we do to cover this area? What can we do to make sure that the players are safe? They're able to affect the game the way they want to play the game. That's within the guidelines of player safety and within the rules.
Okay.
So it's more of just an open dialogue. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. No. And is that a conversation that continues throughout the game? Kind of an open. You guys or girls just kind of talking it through. Obviously, without headsets, that's a wonderful tool.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's a lot easier with headsets.
Yeah, right.
But in the flow of the game, I'll use nonverbal communication. I'll signal,
Okay.
and I'll explain beforehand. If I do this, if I'm pointing down, I need you to look in that area. If I'm pointing backwards, I need you to move back. And then we'll talk every break we can, where we can, conjoin, where we can, move over to a side of the pool, quarter breaks, Usually, obviously not timeouts, unless there's a severe thing we might have to review, where we're going to end up pulling the ball out. And the timeout gave us that opportunity. But it's just continuous, hey, did you see this? Do you need me to cover that? Hey, they're leaving early. Can you help me on that? Every time we get a chance to talk, I think it's crucial.
Right. Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. So we talked a little bit earlier that water polo is such a small world. You're a former coach, and you probably get back in. I talked a little about you getting back into it. And having officiated for a number of years. We both know water polo is such a small world, right? You former players, former colleagues, people you've worked with throughout the years. What's your advice on like how to navigate these relationships and still remain professional?
I think you have to go in with the mindset that, hey, I'm here for the purpose of adjudicating the game and the player safety. And like I said, one of the first things I do after I get dressed is I introduce myself to the coach, even if I know them. I just say, hello, hey, have a good day, walk away. And if they want to have personal conversations, I just remind them, hey, right now is not the time. We can talk on Thursday, it's Sunday, for example.
Right.
We'll talk down the road.
Right.
Because it is so interrelated of a sport. But I think you just have to approach it from a professional standpoint when you first introduce yourself to them that day. And that's something that I've learned from some of the more experienced coaches or referees, where people that I even may have coached at one point, and they come on deck and they're like, hello, how are you? Okay, I'm well. All right, have a good day,
Right.
So it's just a matter of how you establish yourself right away. Or as I've had one senior referee tell me once, what is your brand when you arrive?
Okay.
So
great. So I guess that follows me. What is your brand? That's a great question. I'm thinking to myself, what is my brand too? Right. Like, what would your brand be though? I guess it would be a question.
I think it's to try to be as fair as possible without any, open-ended agenda, which sometimes referees were accused of because the game doesn't go a certain team's way. Or, hey, just like if you watch a professional sport, there are certain styles of play that match a certain referee's interpretation of the game. And just being as fair to what you see in that moment and what you see developing as you can be, and just be consistent with that.
Right.
One of the things I've learned over time is, having been a former coach, I've been accused by senior referees as you are officiating like a coach, meaning you're giving the players the benefit of the doubt in certain situations, rather than giving the rules the benefit of the doubt and holding the players accountable to that interpretation of that rule. So that was something that I've had to learn.
Yeah. I would say so. That not yourself, but me personally as well. When you make that jump, you really have to your mindset definitely changes, right? Because as coaches, we've officiated, thousands of games in practice, but practice scrimmages is completely different than, a high level club game or even the collegiate game.
Yeah, outcomes are different, and the metrics to get to those outcomes are different from those perspectives.
Right. That's very true. So talking a little bit about coaching, what are some ways if you've held a challenging coach, what are some ways that you've learned, besides, yellow card, red card, yellow, red combo, how do you kind of diffuse those potentially volatile situations?
Well, I think understanding what the coach is trying to do in those situations before they become metastasized, before they become a larger issue, is important. I think going into that conversation, if you meet a coach that's very bombastic right away, what is the outcome that they're trying to do? Is it just their personality? Are they trying to leverage your perception of the flow of the game? Or are they simply frustrated with something that maybe is their player and they're projecting onto the referee? And having not a thin skin and not a thick skin, don't be blind to what their outcome goals are in that conversation, but be clear. Okay, coach, I heard you. I appreciate that. I will take a look at that concern, but let's take it a step back. And if they continue, my next approach has always been, look, here's your warning. Please stop. I heard you the first time. Okay. Anything beyond that, I have to give you a card. And I'm trying to be as fair and as neutral in this situation as I can be, and unemotional. Take the emotion out of it. It's not personal. Just like if a kid does something in the water, it's not you as a referee. It's what did you see, and take the emotion out of it, and then be logical in how you approach that situation. And again, because different coaches will use how their behaviors for different outcome goals. So just be logical of what they're trying to get across to you. And like I said, my approach has always been, I listen to the coach. I heard you. Let's move on. And if you can't move on, I have to give you a card.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If you're thinking about, that's being, a little empathetic too as well. You're putting yourself in their position, but yet you're still being fair, and, you're calling the game as you see it.
And that goes back to your question earlier about how to deal with the fact that we're all so interrelated. I mean, I had this conversation after, I think, quarterfinals at Junior Olympics last year, where I had a former Olympic assistant coach and one of the top club coaches from San Diego, who was an assistant coach on the deck, but he decided to remove himself from the bench on his own, and he's chirping about something. And I had never been confronted with that scenario. And I'm working with a senior referee who's on the other side of the deck, and I asked him, how do you want me to handle this? Because I could throw a card out there right away, but the assistant Olympic coach calls a timeout and says, he can't do that. It's like, 100% you're correct. And I missed that moment. So I will address it, but again, trying to give some respect. He wasn't technically on the bench. He had checked in for the game, but then removed himself. And I should have just removed him to the stands in hindsight. But in that moment, because it is so interrelated, I knew both coaches well. And so I was unfortunately given him too much leeway. And again, it's a learning process. In hindsight, hey, you need to go to the stands because you are a spectator at this point. You're not even on the bench. This coach is correct. If you were on the bench, I have to give you a red card. Right. So but again, it's just, I've never been confronted with that as a referee. So it never processed in that moment of that game.
Right. Yeah. And then the next time you see that, obviously you make the proper adjustment, right? It's such an experience-based, process, really.
Yeah.
But yeah. I mean, so tell me a little bit about more so like, you obviously you've worked with some really experienced officials, and obviously you've worked with some novice officials. Like, what are some best practices you suggest, like when you're in those situations, working with a high-level, man or woman, or when you're working with someone who's maybe just starting out, or maybe is a couple years under their belt?
I think across the board, it's communication, and whenever you have a break in the actual officiating, timeouts, quarter breaks, pre and post game, ask questions. And that goes both ways. Ask questions to the novice referees,
right? Because
they might have an insight or a concern that hasn't been explained to them, or a situation they haven't seen that maybe you haven't seen in a while. We just discussed a situation that I dealt with, with knowing experienced coaches well, and how to learn so that situation comes up again, you're more prepared. But working with a senior referee, it's more, here's my perception of what we should be doing. Here's what I'm allowing and what I'm not allowing, and then adapt to what your teammate is doing on the other side of the pool, both in live action and in collaboration conversations. With the novice, it's try to import on them the safety and the flow of the game as far as within the adjudication of the rules. And then help them when you need to, but don't step on their toes, because knowledge is experiential. We want to keep the players safe. That's our first and foremost priority. So that will raise the stakes in what you have to do. But if you can work with that official and encourage them and educate them, even in rough moments, and support them in subtle ways, maybe give it a little bit more extra coverage area to their water without taking too much away from your own responsibility. Or helping mitigate to a coach, being a little quicker. Like I said, I have a lot of experience with a lot of different coaches in different levels. So I feel I have a little more flexibility in how I'm going to handle that coach. But if it's a younger referee and they get on them right away, hey, look, here's a yellow card, knock it off. Like, I have to protect my opponent first and foremost.
Right.
And then asking a senior referee, if I'm that junior referee, what can I do better? What can I do differently to grow?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that answer, David. I think that's really pointing on how working with, experienced officials obviously is easier. You would assume so, right? Um, but working with a novice official, I think it's really important. Like you said, there's an educational piece. There's a don't assume anything, right? They might not necessarily know something that you know about the game and about officiating. They think that's, like you said, experience is learning. I think that's key. I love that answer.
Yeah, we have to be lifelong learners. I mean, the rules change, the interpretations change,
Right.
points of emphasis change, and so it's just a constantly an educational process for everyone.
Right. It brings me to my next question, is what's the toughest part of the game to officiate, right? I mean, you talked about it, that the game, what other sport really, where does the primary rules change every, every 5 years,
Olympiad
right?
or every, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so it's interesting part. So I just kind of want your take. Obviously, the rules are that's out of our control. But what's the toughest part of officiating the game?
Well, I think going back to one of our first questions where I talked about transitioning from a coach's perspective to a referee's perspective,
Okay.
is understanding, giving the players the benefit of the doubt is a double-edged sword. And what I mean by that is, is that foul acceptable to what I think is a level of physical play that's allowable? Or am I giving them too much benefit of the doubt, like, oh, they know what they're doing, or they can handle it? Or no, you have to go back to the platform of what is the priority of the rule? What is the priority of the safety? And if it's in your acceptable range, then be consistent with it. If seems like an outlier, like what just happened? Okay, then you probably should have blown your whistle in that regard, in that situation.
Right.
So because that, especially in the first quarter, as fatigue and mental fatigue happens later in the game, might become a bigger issue because of something you allowed early in the game. So one of the conversations in education we always talk about is being consistent, but being consistent within the framework of what's happening in that moment of the game. A two-hand foul is a two-hand foul regardless, but that part's easy. But is it a two-hand foul if I'm grabbing and I'm reaching for the ball, or is it an over-aggressive foul in the first quarter that now in the fourth quarter causes a fight? And so just understanding what your comfort zone is with the physicality of the game is hard to be consistent, because again, players come out in the first quarter, their adrenaline's going, they're focused, they're sharp, they're ready to go. Third and fourth quarter, they start to hit a wall, they start getting tired. Now mental fatigue checks in, and so reactions start happening. So what have you done the whole game to stay consistent, understanding that part of the psychology of the player to keep them safe?
Right.
And I think the hardest part also is, what is the differentiation between a foul and a simulation? That one of the conversations I've had with some senior level referees is you should only have to call a simulation one time and then, move up the chain of fouls. But as players, we know that if I do this, I can maybe get the referee to buy in, or there was a little bit of contact, but how did it affect the flow of the play at hand? And again, how was that consistent with what I called maybe a quarter prior, or what I anticipate to call a quarter from now?
Yeah, I like what you said about the being consistent and understanding like the ability level of the players and what they're trying to do, but in the same sense, like our priority is safety and being consistent. I think about like that. This was just like perimeter fouls, right? Like especially at the college level or higher level boys and men's and boys games. It's like those they have to be established right away. Hard fouls like on the perimeter, have to be exclusions, right? Because if, like you said, fourth quarter comes around, that could something like that can happen, and it's not called earlier. It can lead to, like you said, lead to a fight.
Yeah, an escalation that nobody wants.
Right. So that's always challenging. Sure.
Yeah.
So you've worked a number of high-level games over the years. do you have one that sticks out that really, can give you something that's memorable? Whether it's a good experience or something you learn from. I know you talked a little bit about the one you had prior with the coach.
Yeah. So a couple years ago, I was doing a high level, it was a high school playoff game, and probably hundreds of people in the stands. I mean, it was a packed crowd, and we had headsets,
Okay.
my partner and I, but we still could barely hear each other. And even with nonverbal communication, it's still hard to decipher what was going on.
Mm.
And a team was on the attack with less than a possession in the half, and it was a 1-goal game at the time. And the offense was driving a clear out from one wing to the opposite, and there was a hold at center on that cross drive.
Okay.
That was an exclusion. I was the front court, my partner was the back court, and so I was watching it. But as I was signaling, there's a glare, and the kids couldn't see me because of where the light stanchion was. So I was repositioning to signal to the front court which of the two players was excluded on defense. And while that happened, the ball was originally at one position. I don't know if we're using numbering, but it was at the closest flat position to me on the back court. So the 4 position.
Okay.
When I started calling the foul. But again, I had to step up. I usually like to step almost to the goal line, between 1 meter to the goal line, depending on the flow of the play. So I stepped up to about 2 meters, and while I was stepping up, I peripherally took my eye off the ball for a minute. I blew the whistle. The ball had already moved 1 spot. My perception was the ball was still at the 4, was still at the flat next to me.
Okay.
So I called the exclusion. There's this weird delay in action, and all of a sudden I see the ball go to the net, to the goal. So I don't have a sight line to the ball initially, which was my mistake. So this really sticks with me. And we're talking about collaboration. So I asked my partner what he sees. He didn't hear my exclusion whistle when I called it. So the point of sequence was there was the ball was at one position, exclusion happened. I see it as a pass, just in my flow of the mind of the play. What happened was there was a pass, the exclusion, that guy plays with the ball a couple times and then shoots it. My partner doesn't hear my whistle. I think it's a different flow of sequence, and we can't communicate because everyone's cheering and screaming and yelling, on both sides. So we finally have to untangle this, but we're on other sides of the pool. It was 2 seconds left by that time in the half. I have to differentiate what's going on with my partner. We can't really resolve it. So I have to go with my gut instinct, which was the action as I saw it, because I took my eye off the ball for a moment, is a goal.
Okay.
So that team now is down by 2 going into half, or the other team's up by 2 going into half. That's how we let it go. And obviously on video and in hindsight, it was the flow of action isn't how we perceived it at the moment, because each of us had a different perception of what happened based on the crowd noise and based on positioning. And so unfortunately, the team that was down by 2 at half lost by a goal, and the team that was up by 2 won by a goal. But that sticks out to me. For just that moment, I took my eye off the ball because I had to, and I had to collaborate. But knowing my environment, I probably would have still just stayed where I was in position and made the call as I saw it from where I was, versus
So I guess
reposition for the players in the water.
what would you have done differently? Just that, if you would have.
I
probably
would have had my
obviously
hips
enough to want to think for the talk, right? You've probably played it over in your mind many times, right?
Yeah, and it's one of those fluke things that sometimes happens. I just would have stayed open to the entire pool rather than step up to just isolate to the 3 pairs that were kind of at my feet.
Right.
So I could have seen if that ball moved or not, and then I would have had a better decision process rather than having to ask my partner, did you see the same thing I did? No. Okay, well, what was the sequence you saw it? You're telling me it's a goal. I have to call it a goal because you were the one technically watching that water.
Right.
But then in hindsight, after we watched the video and we've had time to unwrap this at the time, we were both incorrect. I should have gone with my gut, which was not to call it a goal, but I deferred because it was just, and those things happen, unfortunately. We just want to try to avoid them as much as possible.
Right. So I guess brings me to my final question is, looking back on your first couple games, coaching or officiating, um, whatever level that it might be, and having the experience you have now, what are a few pointers you would maybe give your younger self, just kind of starting out, focusing on and things to avoid?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest things is understand that for these players and for these coaches, it's a huge investment of their time. Like we talked about as a former coach, we referee scrimmage practices and situational scrimmages every day. Understand that our perception from that view is different than what the referee is seeing, and different outcome goals than what the referee is trying to do. So as a referee, especially as a young referee starting out, understand that they have this huge investment. I'm showing up for 1/10 of what they're doing that week. So rather than make it an impact and try to change what they're doing, understand what they're doing and then officiate based on the guidelines that I have and be consistent with both teams with that. In other words, don't be bigger than the game. Insert myself when it's necessary and not think that, I'm in white, I'm the head honcho, I got to do this, I got to do that. Understand that for some of these people, this might be their final game of their entire career.
Right.
Whether it's a playoff game or a tournament, or maybe there's an injury and that's their final game, whatever the circumstances. So treat it with that respect. And as a looking back, again, how many of these can I have? How many of these conversations can I have? How many of these meetings can I go to? How much can I take? And then find out what my own individual comfort zone is. And that's taken some time. We just talked about a mistake in a game that stands out. And so that I think about that. Okay, my positioning may have had a negative impact on that game. How can I leave with a neutral impact on the game? So looking back, that would be my primary thing. What education can I do? What experiences can I learn from by watching, listening, and thinking about it ahead of time?
Right.
Don't go into a game just blind. Like, okay, I'm going to, this is a point of emphasis. But if the team does this, how am I going to respond? If this situation happens, how am I going to be in position to respond? And so just having that forethought going into a game is something that I probably would impress upon myself as a referee.
Awesome. David, man, I really appreciate you taking the time, to talk water polo. This is Damon Newman, and as always, check out our website, AmericanWaterPolo.org. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram. Check out some other interviews we have, educational resources. And this has been the Behind the Whistle series. I appreciate the time, David. Thanks.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.